Clara Bennett had lived her whole life on the dusty edge of Sweetwater, a small western town that baked beneath the sun by day and fell silent under the stars at night. Her father's general store sat just beyond the main street, where the road began to fade into open prairie. There wasn't much to look at: warped wood, faded paint, a bell that jingled weakly when the door opened, but it was hers now. Since her father passed, Clara had kept it running alone, stocking shelves, mending ledgers, and sweeping the same worn floors each evening. To the townsfolk, she was the quiet girl who worked too hard and smiled too softly. They liked her well enough, but no one ever truly saw her. Clara had grown used to it. While other women wore bright ribbons and painted lips, she wore the same faded dress and a simple braid down her back. Her hands were rough from work, her skin freckled from the sun. She knew how she appeared to others: plain, ordinary, forgettable. And though she told herself it didn't matter, a small ache lingered in her heart each time she saw laughter and courtship blooming between others at Sunday gatherings. Her days followed a rhythm as steady as the ticking of the old wall clock. Before sunrise, she'd light the stove, make coffee, and open the shutters to let in the morning air. By mid-morning, farmers and ranch hands would come by for flour, nails, or tobacco. Clara greeted each customer with quiet politeness, never lingering too long in conversation. The men would tip their hats, smile kindly, and move on, back to their lives, their wives, their stories. At night, when the town's lamps dimmed and the last wagon creaked down the road, Clara would sit behind the counter with her father's old account book open before her. She'd dip her pen in ink, the sound of the nib scratching paper the only noise in the room. Sometimes she'd pause, looking toward the window where the moonlight cast its silver glow across the wooden floor. The loneliness never came all at once. It was more like a soft weight that pressed against her shoulders, quiet and familiar. Though many men in town had passed through her shop, none had ever lingered long enough to look beyond her plain face or quiet ways. She'd once been asked to the church picnic by a young farmhand, but when he didn't show, she'd learned her lesson about hoping for more than politeness. Since then, she'd built invisible walls around her heart, strong, quiet walls of self-sufficiency. She didn't expect love, not in the way storybooks described it. For women like her, love wasn't a gift that came knocking. It was something best not wished for. Still, there were moments when her heart betrayed her. When she watched the sunset paint the sky in colors too beautiful to name, or when she saw an old couple walking hand in hand past her window, she'd feel a sting of longing so sharp it caught her breath. Then she'd busy herself again, arranging canned goods, dusting shelves, pretending she didn't notice the emptiness inside her. Clara had her dignity, her work, and her memories. That was enough, she told herself. Yet, deep down, she couldn't help but wonder what it would feel like if someone looked at her, truly looked, and saw more than a storekeeper. Someone who didn't measure her worth by beauty or laughter, but by the quiet steadiness she carried through each lonely day. It was an impossible thought. She believed the kind that belonged to dreams, not life, and so she locked it away with all her other silent hopes. But fate has a habit of finding those who least expect it, and soon. The sound of a stranger's boots crossing her wooden floor would shake the quiet world Clara had built around herself forever. Eli Carter rode into Sweetwater just as the sun dipped low over the horizon, turning the sky into a blaze of gold and crimson. The weary creak of his saddle and the steady rhythm of his horse's hooves were the only sounds that followed him. He'd been traveling for weeks, through dust, storms, and silence, carrying nothing but a bedroll, a weathered hat, and the weight of his past. Eli wasn't a young man anymore. His face bore the marks of years spent under the sun and the burdens that come from living hard. A faint scar traced down his jaw, a souvenir from a bar fight long ago, though the man who'd given it to him was long buried. His eyes were sharp and steady, the kind that had seen too much and judged little. People often took one look at him and stepped aside. There was something about his quiet presence, part caution, part strength, that made folks lower their voices when he walked by. He didn't come to Sweetwater looking for anything more than rest. His horse needed feed and he needed work. Ranches in these parts always had fences to mend, cattle to drive, roofs to fix. He'd done it all before, rode for pay, slept under stars, moved on before roots could take hold. That was the way of a man like him, never staying too long, never giving anyone the chance to ask where he came from or who he used to be. The town itself was small and plain, not much different from a dozen others he'd passed through. A dusty main street lined with a saloon, a blacksmith's forge, a church steeple, and one general store at the far end. That store caught his eye as he rode in, the lantern in the window casting a warm glow that felt oddly welcoming. Something about it reminded him of home, though he hadn't had one in years. When he pushed open the door, the faint ring of a bell and the scent of coffee and sawdust greeted him. Behind the counter stood a young woman, simple dress, hair in a braid, and eyes that flickered with surprise when she saw him. She wasn't painted up like most women he'd met in towns. There was a quietness about her, a kind of grace that didn't need words. "Evenin'," he said, tipping his hat. His voice was low, gravelly from years of dust and disuse. "Evenin'," she replied softly, her hands stilling on the counter. He asked for supplies, coffee, flour, and a length of rope, and she gathered them with careful precision. There was a steadiness in her movements, a gentle focus that made him pause. Most people hurried through life, but not her. When she finally handed him his goods, their fingers brushed, just barely, and she looked away, as if the contact had startled her. He left the store with his bundle, but something about her stayed with him. As he led his horse toward the livery, her image flickered through his mind, the calm of her voice, the honesty in her eyes. He'd met all kinds of women in his wandering life, some bold, some false, some fleeting, but none quite like her. She looked like someone who had weathered her own kind of storms and kept standing anyway. That night, Eli camped just outside town, under a blanket of stars. The fire crackled, the coyotes called, and his thoughts drifted toward that quiet store and the woman inside it. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but something about Sweetwater felt different now. Maybe it was the way her eyes met his without fear. Maybe it was the way she carried her loneliness with quiet dignity. Whatever it was, Eli Carter felt a pull he hadn't felt in years, a whisper that maybe, just maybe, this town was the place where his wandering heart could finally rest. The first few mornings after Eli Carter rode into Sweetwater, Clara told herself that the stranger's visit to her store had meant nothing. Cowboys passed through town all the time, hard men chasing wages or running from the ghosts of their pasts. Still, when she heard the faint jingle of spurs and the creak of the door's old bell 3 days later, something in her chest leapt before she could stop it. Eli stepped inside, tall and broad-shouldered, his hat pulled low against the sun. The scent of dust and leather followed him as he set a small coin purse on the counter. "Need more coffee," he said simply, his voice deep, roughened by the trail. Clara nodded, reaching for the familiar tin on the shelf. "You must drink a lot of it," she said quietly, measuring it out with steady hands. "Only thing that keeps a man awake through long rides," he replied, offering a faint smile, barely there but real. It made her heart skip in a way that startled her. She slid the coffee across the counter and busied herself with the register to hide the warmth rising in her cheeks. He lingered that morning, asking a few questions about the town, who owned the ranches nearby, whether the church still held services on Sundays. He wasn't talkative, but when he did speak, his words carried weight. Clara found herself listening more closely than she meant to, her usual shyness softening beneath his quiet tone. When he finally left, she stood for a long moment by the window, watching him walk down the road. The sunlight caught the edge of his hat brim, the outline of his figure strong against the horizon. She told herself it was nothing, just a passerby, but her fingers trembled slightly when she went back to her work. Over the next few weeks, he came often, sometimes for supplies, sometimes for no reason at all. He'd lean a shoulder against the doorframe, asking how business was or whether the rains had helped the crops. They never spoke of personal things, yet each conversation stretched a little longer than the last. Clara, who had spent years mastering the art of quiet invisibility, began to feel seen in a way she hadn't before. But that scared her. She didn't know how to accept attention that wasn't pity or politeness. She noticed everything, how his eyes softened when she spoke, how he always thanked her as though her small kindnesses truly mattered. One afternoon, she caught sight of her reflection in the shop's window as he was leaving. Her plain braid, her simple dress, her freckled face, it all looked painfully ordinary beside a man like him. "He's just being kind," she whispered to herself. That's all, so the next time he came, she was quieter. She kept her eyes on the counter, her tone clipped. He noticed, of course. Eli had a way of sensing what others didn't say. When he asked if something was wrong, she shook her head, pretending to be busy. The truth was, she didn't want to hope. Hope had disappointed her before, and it hurt worse than loneliness. Later that evening, Eli sat outside the boarding house, rolling a cigarette he never lit. He thought about her, about the way she hid behind her shyness like someone protecting a wound. He'd met proud women, broken women, angry women, but never one who carried her gentleness like armor. He didn't know why he cared, but he did. Something about her steadiness called to him in a way he hadn't felt in years. And though Clara tried to tell herself that Eli Carter was just another passing cowboy, her heart betrayed her every time she heard that familiar bell above the door. Somewhere deep inside, behind the walls she'd built so carefully, a tiny crack had begun to form, and through it, the faint light of something new began to shine. Autumn came to Sweetwater with the scent of apples and hay, the sky deepening to a softer blue as harvest season began. The town grew livelier with each passing day, talk of the annual harvest dance buzzing through every doorway and dusty street. For most, it was the highlight of the year, a night of fiddles, laughter, and lanterns strung high over the barnyard floor. Clara Bennett, however, had no plans to attend. The week before the dance, several women stopped by her store, chattering excitedly as they bought ribbons and lace. "You'll be coming, won't you, Miss Bennett?" one of them asked kindly. Clara smiled faintly, pretending to check her stock. "I've too much to do," she replied, though she knew the lie sat heavy in her chest. She didn't belong among twirling skirts and bright laughter. She'd never been asked to dance before, and she doubted that would change now. When Saturday came, the town gathered at the old barn near the creek. The music drifted through the night air, fiddles, stomping boots, the cheerful rhythm of joy she could hear even from her porch. Inside her dimly lit store, Clara stood by the window, watching the flicker of lanterns from afar. She imagined the scene. Girls in their prettiest dresses, men tipping their hats, and somewhere among them, Eli Carter. She hadn't seen him for 3 days. The thought of him at the dance, perhaps smiling at one of the town's prettier women, sent a dull ache through her chest. She tried to shake it off, stacking boxes, straightening shelves, doing anything to keep her hands busy. But the music wouldn't stop drifting in, haunting and sweet. Meanwhile, Eli had indeed gone to the dance, but only because old man Randall, the rancher who'd hired him for fence work, had insisted. The barn was bright and full of life, but Eli felt out of place among the laughter and perfume. Women smiled at him, and a few even tried to draw him into conversation, but his mind wasn't there. It was back at the quiet edge of town, in a small general store that smelled of coffee and pine soap. After an hour, he left the dance without a word. He saddled his horse and rode toward town, the moonlight silvering the road. He wasn't sure why he was going, only that he couldn't stand the noise of people pretending to be happy when the one person who wasn't pretending sat alone. When he reached Clara's store, the window still glowed with soft light. Through the glass, he saw her kneeling by a stack of crates, sleeves rolled up, hair falling loose from her braid. She looked up in surprise as he stepped through the door, brushing rain and dust from his coat. "Mr. Carter," she said, startled. "Shouldn't you be at the dance?" He shrugged, setting his hat on the counter. "Wasn't my kind of crowd." Clara blinked, unsure what to say. Her cheeks warmed under his steady gaze. "You came all the way back here?" she asked quietly. He nodded once. Seemed to me this was the only place worth being. For a moment, silence stretched between them, gentle, comfortable, almost sacred. The lamplight softened the edges of the room, casting a golden glow over her face. She looked away, embarrassed by the flutter in her chest, pretending to fuss with the jars on the shelf. "Would you like some coffee?" she finally offered, her voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, that small, knowing smile of his. "I'd like that." So they sat together at the counter, 2 cups between them, the distant sound of the dance fading into the night. They didn't need music or laughter. The quiet between them said enough. And as the clock ticked softly on the wall, Clara realized something she'd never dared to admit before. Eli Carter wasn't just another passerby. He was the first man who'd ever chosen her company over a room full of prettier faces. For a few fleeting weeks after the harvest dance, Clara Bennett found herself smiling without realizing it. Life in Sweetwater went on as usual. The dusty streets, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the slow rhythm of a small town, but something in her world had shifted quietly. Eli Carter had become a steady presence in her days. He'd stop by the store most mornings before heading out to the Randall Ranch, sometimes buying a few simple things, sometimes just leaning on the counter with that quiet look of his. They didn't speak much about deep things, yet the silences between them felt easier now, comfortable, almost warm. Sometimes he'd bring her small tokens from the land, wildflowers tucked in his saddlebag, a handful of smooth stones from the creek. Clara never asked why. She simply smiled, placed them on the shelf behind the counter, and pretended her heart wasn't fluttering like a schoolgirl's. But in a town as small as Sweetwater, peace never lasted long. It began with whispers, soft at first, then louder. Two women passing by the store one morning, voices low but sharp. "Have you seen her with that drifter? Always hanging around like she's trying to catch herself a man." "Her? Please, he'll be gone by winter. Men like him don't settle for plain girls like that." Clara stood just inside the doorway, a crate of soap in her hands. The words hit her harder than she expected, her stomach twisting painfully. She waited until the women were gone before setting the crate down, her fingers trembling. She told herself it didn't matter, that gossip had always been a part of town life, but deep inside, the cruel truth of their words found a place to stick. That evening, she tried to keep her smile steady when Eli stopped by. He noticed the change immediately. "You all right, Clara?" he asked softly. "Just tired," she replied, keeping her eyes on the ledger. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded, though she could tell he didn't believe her. The next few days, she kept her distance. When he spoke, she answered politely but briefly. When he offered to help her carry a shipment, she refused. And when his hand brushed hers one morning as they passed a coin, she pulled away too quickly. Eli said nothing at first, but her coldness weighed on him. That night, sitting by the fire outside town, he thought of her pale face and downcast eyes. He'd seen that look before, in women who'd been hurt by words sharper than knives. He didn't know what had been said, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let her face it alone. A few days later, Clara was sweeping the porch when the two same women passed again. "Poor thing," one of them whispered loudly. "She really believes he's staying," the other laughed. "Wait till he rides out like the rest of them." Before Clara could retreat inside, a familiar voice cut through the air. "You got something to say about me. Best say it to my face." Eli stood at the end of the porch, his jaw tight, eyes hard as flint. The women paled and hurried off, muttering apologies. Clara froze, her heart pounding. She'd never seen him angry before. It was a quiet, protective anger, the kind that didn't need shouting to be felt. When the street fell silent again, she looked down, ashamed. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered. "Now they'll just talk more. Let 'em," he said simply. "People who talk like that don't know truth when it's standing right in front of them." Clara's throat tightened. She turned away, blinking back tears she didn't want him to see. "They're not wrong, Eli. You could have any woman you wanted. Someone prettier, someone who fits your world." He looked at her for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then quietly he said, "Maybe I'm tired of pretty. Maybe I'm looking for real." Before she could answer, he tipped his hat and walked away down the dusty street, leaving her standing on the porch with her broom, her heart trembling with something halfway between fear and hope. The storm came without warning. By late afternoon, the wind was already howling through the canyons, tossing dust and grit across Sweetwater's main street. The sky darkened to a heavy gray, the kind that meant trouble was coming. Merchants hurried to shutter their windows. Mothers gathered their children from the yard, and the scent of rain mixed with the iron tang of lightning on the air. Clara Bennett had seen many storms in her life, but something about this one felt different, meaner, louder, more determined. By the time she'd bolted the doors of her general store, the rain was coming down in thick sheets, slamming against the glass. She hurried to move what she could: sacks of flour, crates of canned goods, anything that might be ruined if the water found its way in. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, making the lanterns flicker. Thunder rolled overhead, close enough to make her heart jump. She just reached for another box when the first leak began, thin but steady, dripping down the back wall where the roof had weakened. She grabbed a bucket and set it beneath the stream, watching helplessly as water began pooling near the shelves. "Oh no," she murmured, voice trembling. The rain was seeping faster now, soaking through the boards. Alone, she worked as fast as she could, her braid coming loose, her sleeves clinging to her arms. Then came a knock, hard and sudden, at the door. She froze. No one in their right mind would be out in weather like this. Another knock followed, louder this time. She hurried to the entrance, pulling the bolt free, and when she opened it, a rush of cold air nearly took her breath away. Eli Carter stood there, soaked to the bone, his hat dripping, his coat plastered to his frame. His eyes flicked over her, then past her to the chaos inside. "Roof's leaking," he said, his voice low but urgent. "I saw the light from down the road." "I'm fine," she insisted, though her voice trembled. "You shouldn't be out." But he was already inside, closing the door against the wind. Without another word, he rolled up his sleeves and began lifting the heavier crates from the floor, moving them to the counter. Clara hesitated for only a moment before joining him. Together they worked silently, the storm roaring around them, thunder cracking like a gunshot outside. After nearly an hour, the worst of it passed. They stood side by side, soaked and breathless, their hands red from work. Water dripped from the ceiling in slow, steady taps, but the store was safe, for now. "Thank you," she whispered, brushing wet hair from her face. "You didn't have to come." Eli turned toward her, his gaze steady and unreadable. "Couldn't let you face it alone." Something in his tone, gentle but firm, unraveled the composure she'd been clinging to. She looked down, her voice barely audible. "You shouldn't keep helping me, Eli. Folks already talk. They say I'm not enough for someone like you." He frowned slightly. "Enough?" She swallowed hard. "You deserve someone prettier," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Someone who doesn't make people stare and wonder what you're doing wasting time here." The room went still except for the patter of rain. Eli stepped closer, his boots echoing softly against the wood. When he spoke, his words were low but certain. "I don't want someone prettier. Clara, I've seen plenty of pretty lies, pretty promises, pretty faces that turn cold when life gets hard." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "I deserve someone real, someone who doesn't paint herself to please the world, someone who means what she says." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, hot against her cool skin. For a long moment she couldn't speak. The rain outside slowed to a whisper, the lantern light softening between them. Eli reached out, gently tucking a strand of damp hair behind her ear. "You're real, Clara," he murmured. "That's worth more than any pretty face I ever saw." And in that small, flickering light, surrounded by the scent of rain and dust, Clara felt something shift inside her, a fragile hope, blooming where doubt used to live, outside. The storm finally passed, but inside the little store, something far stronger had begun. When dawn finally crept over Sweetwater, it found the town drenched and battered but still standing. The storm had torn shingles from roofs and left puddles deep enough to swallow wagon wheels. Smoke rose from chimneys as folks emerged from their homes, blinking into the pale morning light, counting what the night had taken and what it had spared. At the edge of town, the general store looked weathered but intact. Clara Bennett stood in the doorway, her shoulders wrapped in Eli's worn coat. Her own shawl had been soaked beyond use, and though she'd protested when he'd placed his coat around her, he hadn't taken no for an answer. Now it hung over her shoulders, heavy and warm, smelling faintly of leather, smoke, and something steady, something that felt like safety. The store had suffered some damage, a broken shutter, a sagging section of roof, a few ruined sacks of flour, but nothing she couldn't mend. As she surveyed the mess, she felt the ache of exhaustion settle into her bones. But underneath it all was something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Eli had stayed through the night. After the rain had quieted, he'd built a small fire in the stove and coaxed her to sit beside it, wrapping her hands around a steaming cup of coffee. Neither of them had said much after that moment in the storm. Their words still hung in the air between them, fragile and full of meaning. Now, as the morning light touched his face, Clara saw the lines around his eyes more clearly, the scar on his jaw catching the light. He looked older than she'd first thought, but there was a quiet strength in him that steadied her heart. "You should get some rest," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I'll patch that roof before noon." She shook her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "You've done enough, Eli. I can't keep letting you—" "Stop," he interrupted gently. "You don't owe me thanks. You needed help. That's all." But Clara heard something unspoken beneath his words, something deeper. It wasn't pity that kept bringing him back to her door. It was care, honest and simple, the kind that didn't need to be dressed in fancy words. As they worked side by side that morning, sweeping water out the door, stacking what could be saved and laughing softly when the broom handle splintered, they drew quiet stares from passing townsfolk. People whispered, just as they always had. Yet this time Clara didn't look away. She met their glances with calm eyes, her chin lifted just slightly higher. At one point, Mrs. Hargreaves from the millinery shop stopped outside, hands on her hips. "Well," she said, her voice sugary and sharp, "you two certainly weathered the storm together, didn't you?" Eli straightened slowly, wiping his hands on his sleeves. "That we did, ma'am," he replied, tone easy but unyielding. "Ain't a thing wrong with helping your neighbor when the wind starts blowing." The woman blinked, unsure how to answer, then hurried off down the street. Clara had to bite her lip to keep from laughing. "You didn't have to defend me," she murmured once the woman was gone. He looked at her then, his expression serious. "Wasn't defending you, Clara. Just telling the truth." The rest of the day passed slowly, the store filling again with light and warmth. By late afternoon, the damage was nearly repaired, and a golden calm settled over the little building. Clara found herself sitting on the porch steps, watching the road shimmer in the sun. Eli sat beside her, hat in his hand, silent but near. For a long time, they didn't speak. The wind moved gently through the grass, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. Then softly, Clara said, "You should know something, Eli. I used to think I was invisible. That no one saw me, not really." She turned to meet his gaze. "But you did." He didn't answer right away, just looked out toward the horizon. Then finally he said, "Maybe that's 'cause I know what it's like not to be seen." And in that quiet, simple moment, with the world still drying around them, Clara realized something true. Eli hadn't just brought her through a storm of rain, but through a storm of doubt. For the first time in her life, she felt the sunlight, not just on her face, but in her heart. Months passed in Sweetwater, each one leaving the town, and its people subtly changed. The days grew shorter, the prairie winds sharper, but the warmth in Clara Bennett's life had grown in ways she had never imagined. The general store, once a quiet outpost at the edge of town, now carried a liveliness to it, a little extra laughter in the aisles, the soft hum of conversation, and the steady presence of Eli Carter. Clara had repaired and improved the store over the weeks following the storm, arranging shelves with care, mending the old counters, and even placing small vases of wildflowers Eli often brought from the creek. It was no longer just a place of business, it was a home, a space filled with quiet joy and simple beauty. And at the heart of it, she herself had changed. The walls of shyness and self-doubt that had once protected her were slowly crumbling, replaced by a confidence she hadn't known she could hold. Eli had become a constant companion, though the people of Sweetwater were careful not to say it aloud. He would help her carry supplies, fix fences around the property, or simply sit with her on the porch at dusk, watching the sun set over the endless prairie. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic gestures, just the steady, unwavering presence of a man who had chosen to stay, not because of beauty or charm, but because of the quiet truth he saw in her. One crisp autumn morning, travelers passing through asked about Eli. A few curious voices whispered in the general store. "Is he courting Miss Bennett? I hear he doesn't waste time on any other woman." Clara's cheeks warmed, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled quietly, standing behind the counter as though nothing had changed. Eli, standing beside her, tipped his hat and looked down at her with a faint grin. "She's the reason I stopped riding," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of honesty. The words weren't loud, but they were enough. Enough for the town to understand, enough for Clara to believe in the possibility she'd long kept buried. Even now, years of self-doubt surfaced from time to time. Clara would sometimes whisper to him as they worked side by side, "You deserve someone prettier." The old refrain she'd thought would always define her. Each time, Eli would glance at her, that familiar, steady gaze, and reply with the same quiet certainty, "I already found someone better. Better than pretty. Better than polished, better than what the world expected. Someone real, someone steadfast, someone whose quiet strength could weather storms and still shine in the small ways that truly mattered. Their days fell into a gentle rhythm: work, shared meals, quiet evenings by the lamp, and walks across the prairie under the stars. Clara laughed more than she had in years, and Eli found himself enjoying not just the simplicity of her company, but the depth of it, the way her kindness touched everyone around her, the way her honesty made him feel lighter, freer than he had in decades. As the town grew accustomed to their bond, people began to see Clara differently. Not just as the quiet storekeeper at the edge of town, but as a woman who had captured the heart of a man like Eli Carter, a man who was known to see the world with a wary, guarded eye. The town understood, silently acknowledging that something rare and true had grown in their midst. On warm summer evenings, as the prairie winds whispered through the tall grasses and the sky blushed with the last light of day, Clara and Eli would sit together on the porch, sipping coffee and sharing soft smiles. And in those moments, the world narrowed to just the two of them, two hearts who had found in each other something worth holding on to, something that made life not just bearable, but beautiful. Clara had once believed she was invisible, ordinary, unworthy of love, but Eli's choice had proven otherwise. In the quiet, steadfast way of their days, she had become the woman he had chosen, real, cherished, and finally seen. And that was more than enough.